the darkest days in Hong Kong. Although I was all the while in hospital, you look at what was there on TV. The airports and the streets were just eerily empty. And the economy suffered tremendously. But then the whole society was united. The neighbors would take care of the kids for healthcare workers who dared not go home. And there were lots of support for the ones fighting SARS. So that was a good demonstration of solidarity that can be possible in our society. I hope that will linger.
Claire Bowes reporting. And Dile Masugu is back in the presenter hot seat for Outlook over the weekend with the Syrian love story that started with a resume. But for now, from me, Emily Webb, and the Outlook team, have a lovely morning, afternoon or evening wherever you are in the world.
This is the BBC World Service, where the incredible story of the doomed Apollo 13 moon mission continues.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
I knew we were in deep, deep trouble.
2 of the 3 fuel cells are down, and the spacecraft is leaking oxygen.
We're not going to the moon anymore. We're going to just be lucky to get home.
Apollo 13 with Kevin Fong. Today at 11:30 and 23:30 GMT. And in 30 minutes, World Football with Manny Jasmy.
This week we hear from the hero of Saarbrücken, goalkeeper Daniel Batz, who saved 5 penalties in 1 match as the team from the 4th tier reached the semi-finals of the German Cup. We'll also hear Odion Ogalo's joy at playing for his boyhood club, Manchester United.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Coming up here on the BBC World Service after the news is Hard Talk with me, Zainab Badawi. Tens of thousands of people around the world have been affected by the Covid-19 virus, and more than 4,000 have lost their lives. But even those whose health is not at risk face suffering the disastrous financial impact of the spread of the disease. Livelihoods could be disrupted, and a crisis like the crash of 2008 could be on the cards. That is the prediction made 6 years ago by my guest, Professor Ian Goldin.
It's almost inevitable that as we connect more, as more and more people live in big cities close to airports, which are not only the super spreaders of the goods of globalization, but also the bads, that contagion would cascade around the world. We've seen many pandemics in the past. They've always been the biggest killers of humanity. And I believed that this continued to be a major threat that was being ignored.
That's Professor Ian Goldin on Hard Talk after the news.
Hello, this is the BBC News with Fiona MacDonald. Stock markets are again recording huge losses as the global panic over the coronavirus pandemic continues. The Nikkei index in Japan fell more than 10% at one stage, while Hong Kong's Hang Seng opened 7% down. In South Korea, the rush to sell triggered a 20-minute halt in trading. The tumult follows spectacular falls in the United States and Europe on Thursday. Mariko Oy has more.
It's looking like yet another brutal day here in Asian markets across the region, from Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Hong Kong. They're truly in the red. In fact, it's interesting to point out the mainland Chinese market like Shanghai and Shenzhen, their falls are slightly less compared to the rest of the region, partly because the situation there seems to be stabilizing.
Portugal, Belgium and France have become the latest European countries to close schools to counter the spread of Covid-19. In Belgium, bars and restaurants will also shut from Saturday. In Italy, the number of dead has risen above 1,000, but officials said their strict lockdown measures were working. The German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, said there were huge challenges ahead.
We're in an extraordinary situation in every sense. I would say more extraordinary than the banking crisis, because we're dealing with a health problem, a health challenge for which scientists and doctors don't have an answer yet. Our job now is to first save lives as best as we can, and second, to keep the economy going. Both tasks are challenging, and we want to master them.
A judge in the United States has ordered that the former intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning should be immediately released from prison. She's been detained since May last year for contempt of court after refusing to appear at an inquiry into the WikiLeaks website. The United Nations Special Envoy for Yemen has warned that the country is at risk of a new cycle of violence and suffering. Martin Griffiths told the UN Security Council that all parties to the conflict must steer Yemen away from what he called its precarious path. Here's our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette.
Mr. Griffiths said Yemen was at a critical juncture. Warring parties will either move towards de-escalation and a political process, or, he feared, towards greater violence and suffering. This year began as one of the quietest periods in this punishing war, but in recent weeks fighting has intensified. Mr. Griffiths highlighted what he called an alarming military escalation in the northeast, where Houthi fighters recently seized a strategic provincial capital in Al Jouf, and the Saudi-led coalition backing the government resumed its blistering airstrikes.
You're listening to the latest world news from the BBC. The United States has launched retaliatory strikes after a pro-Iranian militia group in Iraq killed 2 Americans and a British soldier in a rocket attack on a base north of Baghdad. The Pentagon confirmed that there had been what it called defensive precision strikes against militia facilities. The President of Ivory Coast, Alassane Ouattara, has named a close ally as the ruling party's candidate to succeed him. President Ouattara, who announced last week that he would not seek re-election, said Amadou Gon Coulibaly, the current Prime Minister, had the support of the party members. It's not yet clear who will oppose him in October's presidential election. A prayer meeting has been held in the New Zealand city of Christchurch ahead of the first anniversary of mass shootings which killed more than 50 people. Hundreds of worshippers from the 2 mosques targeted by the gunmen attended the event inside a sports arena. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, said she believed New Zealand had fundamentally changed since the attack. The president of football's governing body in the US, Carlos Cordero, has resigned and apologised for offending the national women's team. It follows comments made in a legal battle over equal pay between US soccer and a group of female players. More on the story from Anne Busby.
They've won the World Cup 4 times and have 5 Olympic gold medals. But in legal papers, US soccer said the women's national team had less skill and fewer responsibilities than their male counterparts, who have never won a major international tournament. Mr. Cordero didn't write the offending words, but said he should have reviewed them before they were submitted, acknowledging that they had caused great pain. The language, described by the women as plain sexist, prompted an on-field protest by the team this week, with players wearing their warm-up tops inside out to obscure the US soccer logo.
BBC News.
Welcome to Hard Talk on the BBC World Service with me, Zainab Badawi. The Covid-19 crisis is not only a threat to people's health and well-being, it is already having severe financial consequences, which many fear will result in a crisis of the kind we saw more than a decade ago. My guest is a professor on globalisation and development, who's also worked extensively advising governments, including in his own native South Africa. He is Ian Goldin, and 6 years ago, he predicted that the next financial crash would be caused by a pandemic. Will his prophecy come to pass, that a public health emergency will lead to a global recession, or can this be averted? Ian Goldin, welcome to Hard Talk.
Pleasure to be here.
So what made you predict 6 years ago that the next global financial crash would be caused by a pandemic?
It's almost inevitable that as we connect more, as more and more people live in big cities close to airports, which are not only the super spreaders of the goods of globalization, but also the bads, that contagion would cascade around the world. We've seen many pandemics in the past. They've always been the biggest killers of humanity. And I believed that this continued to be a major threat that was being ignored. And so I felt very strongly, and still do, that this is likely to be not only the biggest threat to our lives, but also to our financial systems and economies.
You said that the coronavirus shows how globalization spreads contagion of all kinds. So you're attributing it there to globalization, but I have to put it to you that during the Spanish flu outbreak in 1918, when eventually 50 million people died, there wasn't globalization then in the sense that we talk about it today.
No, there wasn't, and that was spread largely through troops returning home from Europe after the war. Shipping was the way and that's why it was so slow. and it affected 1/3 of the world's population in some way. 50 million died. Now we have this, but in a much more virulent form, given our connectivity, and the threat is much more instantaneous. We've seen in cyber that it can instantly spread around the world. We've seen in the financial crisis how overnight there was cascading risk. And with pandemics near big airport hubs, anything can be anywhere in the world in 36 hours.
And you attribute that to globalization?
Yes, it is a result of globalization, which has brought immense benefits. I'm a huge believer in it. It's brought better things for more people more quickly than anything in the world, which is why 2 billion people have been lifted out of poverty, why you have these rapidly growing cities, these airport hubs and things. But globalization is also very bad and very ugly, and it's that needs to be managed to ensure we can sustain it.
You've been making comparisons between the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 and what we are seeing now, and attributing it, as we said, to globalization, but you're not really comparing like with like. One is a health emergency and another one was born of finance.
What I analyze in my book, The Butterfly Defect, is how these integrated complex systems lead to interdependency. And in that sense, it's very similar. It's about something that starts somewhere in a hub, spreading around the world rapidly through the arteries of globalization. In that case, it was finance. In this case, it's airports and airlines and travel. But they are similar, both in the way that they originate and travel, but also that we need to think about their management in similar ways. We need to think about the need to coordinate to stop these things.
All right, so there was a crash then more than a decade ago, real financial crisis. Are you saying that we are now heading towards a global recession, or are we already in one?
I think we're on the cusp. I think we're at the cliff edge, and it's really up to us and our governments that decide whether we're going to be heading over it or are able to reverse our actions. I think concerted actions by governments, nationally and globally, could avert a major crisis, a collapse equivalent to 2008. But if we don't do more quickly, I think we are heading for that, and it could be much more severe.
I'll ask you what you think we should do in a moment, but let's just examine the severity of what you believe may happen. Angel Talavera at Oxford Economics says it seems pretty difficult to avoid a recession in the first half of the year. The spread of the disease in Europe is a game changer. The questions are how deep it will be and how long it will last. So if you say we're on the cusp, just elucidate. I mean, when will we get into it, and how long do you think it will last? Is it a given that it's going to happen?
I think we're definitely going to have a major slowdown in the world economy. We could well see negative growth in much of Europe, even in the US, and we could see much slower growth it's over 6% down to 2% in China. So this will slow things down. If countries respond by rapidly addressing the crisis, by transferring money to those that most need it, to helping those that can't get to work, to trying to sustain businesses so that they don't go bankrupt through underwriting their loans, extending their loans in other ways, and if there's a coordinated global activity to give money to those countries that are going to desperately need it, including Italy and many developing countries that are already on the verge of bankruptcy, then we might avoid the worst effects. But I think, yes, we are heading to a recession.
But, I mean, let's be honest, you don't really know. I mean,
no one
the
knows.
Experts don't know. Mohammed Al-Arian, Chief Economic Advisor to Allianz, says the negative effects will be with us for a while. Fasten your seatbelt hard. The British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, says there'll be a significant impact on the UK economy, but it will be temporary. I mean, it's all words like this, a while, temporary. It's all a bit sort of obfuscatory language, isn't it?
I don't think it's obfuscatory. We just don't know. We don't know how extreme the pandemic's going to be in Britain. Is it going to be like Italy, or is it going to be much milder? Are we going to bounce back quickly, as in fact China, Hubei province has, or will it linger longer? Is it going to transfer to the southern hemisphere as winter comes there? There are many questions we don't, and the experts don't know the answers to. And they all have dramatic implications for the economic impact. So we know it's going to be a big knock. We know it's probably going to be equivalent to 2008. What we don't
For
know...
sure, for sure.
I feel it will be, yes.
All right.
But I don't know how it's going to play out around the world, because I also don't know what the response of governments are going to be.
And
we
for how
don't know.
long?
And that's right.
So you just said we know that there's going to be an economic impact. So what kind of impact are we talking about? Is it going to affect people's livelihoods? Are they going to be compromised? Are there going to be widespread shortages of consumer and industrial goods? Impact on people's social lives? What kind of impact are you talking about?
All of the above.
All of the above, yeah.
We're already seeing a dramatic impact on people who are vulnerable. So people's pensions have gone down dramatically through the stock market crash. They have less money to spend. People who are on hourly work, that's over 5 million people in the UK. Over 50 million people in the US, people around the world who are on hourly work, who depend on going to work to get their income, who don't have sick pay, who don't have unemployment benefit, who are supporting their families, migrant workers, but also domestic workers, people in the travel industry, people who work in hospitality of different types, restaurants, hotels, and all of these people are extremely vulnerable. Their workplace will be closed down, or the airline, as British Airways is telling people, don't come to work, to certain staff in Italy, for example, or they'll be quarantined because they know someone or have been somewhere, and that is their livelihood. So I think this will exacerbate inequality. I think it will slow economic growth. That means the businesses that are producing things that we consume, whether it's restaurant meals or whether it's clothing, we don't go to the shops anymore, whatever it is, all of these businesses go out of work. And then, of course, the supply chains are being disrupted as well. We can't get the components. So the auto factories start closing down. Other factories start going down.
So people's cars break down, they can't fix them.
Or they can't buy a new one because it's not in stock.
Public transport vehicles are going to be compromised.
So this then leads to a decline in demand, a decline in supply, and we're going to a downward spiral of consumer confidence and declining economic activity. That's how the 2008 crash happened, and that's how crashes generally happen, is that you get this downward spiral and then a much lower level of activity.
You said it will also exacerbate inequality. So is that within countries and also between countries, that basically poorer nations and poorer communities within countries are going to bear the brunt harder?
I think within our countries it will exacerbate inequality. If there's a strong safety net, that will somewhat reduce it, but many countries, including the US and many poor countries, don't have safety nets. So if people lose their job or whatever, they can't get it. People don't have access to medical care. In the US, there's over 20 million people don't have access to medical care. They're uninsured. These people cannot get tested or will not be able to go to hospitals. So it exacerbates the inequalities within countries dramatically. It also makes people that depend on things like retirement savings much worse off.
Although, I mean, obviously the virus doesn't discriminate against people depending on their wealth.
That's the difference between a pandemic and other shocks.
The rich industrial north of Italy is the one that's most severely affected.
But within
10,000 cases there.
Within that, the rich have savings. The rich have the ability to withstand these crises, whereas poor people, when they lose their income, can become destitute. They can become homeless if they can't pay the rent. So the impact is different, and that's also between countries, because poorer countries don't have the resources, they don't have the health systems and other systems in place.
Professor Goldin, though, I mean, are you not scaremongering a bit? Because the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, says panic and fear is the worst. Are you not doing that with all the things you're just saying? I mean, the scientists are saying, look, by the end of the year, we might have a vaccine which we'll be able to roll out and so on.
I hope we will.
Well, I mean, that's what they're saying. Professor Sarah Gilbert from Oxford University has said, hopefully by the end of the year, she's one of the scientists involved.
I hope that my worst fears aren't realized, and as Roosevelt said in 1933, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
No, but you're scaremongering, was my point.
No, I'm not scaremongering. I'm saying we need
this massive apocalyptic vision of what's going to happen.
I'm saying that there could be a dramatic crash coming out of this, and that the outcome will depend, as all the outcomes of systemic risk, on what we do about it. The reason to raise the red flags, or at least the orange lights, is because you want people to act. I want governments to act. I want them to stop this. I want the international community to act to stop the next pandemic, to learn from this, which it never did.
But they are doing that.
Crisis.
They are doing that both in terms of mitigation and containment against COVID-19. The European Union Commission has set up a €25 billion fund. Giuseppe Conte, the Prime Minister of Italy, has said we're going to have €7.5 billion for spending measures. I mean, you know...
But these numbers are tiny compared to what was given to solve the financial crisis. Alistair Darling set aside 500...
He's the former Labour politician who was
the Chancellor at the time of the financial crisis set aside £500 billion to bail out the banks. The US Treasury Secretary set aside $750 billion to bail out the US banks.
So you're saying that countries have to pay
I'm delighted that the Chancellor today set aside £30 billion, and what he's allocating for is in the UK is very sensible. But compared to the response in the financial crisis, this is tiny.
So what, you're talking about?
We should be
finding money of that order, hundreds of billions?
If needed. I think we should have the ammunition that's going to be required.
But I mean, I put it to you that containment and mitigation measures have been undertaken and they're having some success. Well, Dr. Tedros at the WHO has praised China for its containment, so they've now got fewer cases. South Korea has seen a decline in cases, Singapore also, and you know, he has said, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, that the bottom line is we are not at the mercy of the virus. So things are working without these vast injections of funds that you're advocating.
I would say it's too early to say. It's worked in China, dramatic action. 1/3 of the population quarantined or stopping movement.
South Korea,
in Italy, we have an absolute clampdown. That's not what's happening in other countries, not least in the UK or Germany and the US. It's too early to tell how this virus is going to spread, how many people will be affected, and what the impact on the economy is. What I'm signaling is that it could be dramatic. We should be prepared for that, and we should be prepared to react dramatically to stop that happening.
And you have said that we have to act dramatically to stop that happening. Lots of money, new ways of working. You've also said greater cooperation, because this is a global threat and you can't just have nation states responding in their way. But I mean, what are you advocating? What should nations be doing? Working through what structure?
I think what's compounded the risks now is that in 2008 the world was relatively harmonious. George Bush called a meeting immediately after the 2008 crisis, and you had 20 heads of state, including the Chinese participating. China threw in more money in a coordinated action than the rest of the world put together to mitigate the impact of the 2008 crisis. Now the world has turned its back on international activity.
Well, you don't want everybody to gather at some big summit, do you?
You don't have to gather at a summit, but what you do need is coordinated action. What you do need is a US which isn't fighting the country that was its key ally in this in 2008, China, whether it's on climate change, whether it's on pandemics, whether it's on cyber, whether it's on finance, whenever it's any of the big risks we face, we need to work together as nations.
So
and what worries me now...
Though? We've got the World Health Organization.
But the World Health Organization has been starved of resources, of legitimacy, of authority. It isn't up to 21st century purposes. The reason we're having these pandemics...
It's not fit because it doesn't have the resources.
It doesn't have the resources.
Lots of countries don't pay their contributions.
Pandemics are unusual and different to finance or climate in that a pandemic risk can come from anywhere. The poorest countries are a big risk, whereas in climate, a small group of countries could solve most of the problem, and the same is true in finance. But it doesn't have the surveillance monitoring capability around the world to identify pandemics at source, and when they arise, to act on them and stop them. And that's what you need with the pandemic. Once it's in a major airport, it's really everywhere in the world.
So should there be new structures?
I think we need to reinvigorate them, reform them, give them the resources, and put our will behind them to stop the next pandemic.
All right. The British journalist and commentator in the Financial Times, Robert Armstrong, says coronavirus is a global crisis, not a crisis of globalization, and that globalization provides the solution. And that is what you are saying. But as you know, there's been a lot of retreat from globalisation across the world. A lot of voters have said we're not reaping the benefits of globalisation. We've seen politicians such as Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party leader here in the UK, railing against it. Bernie Sanders, the US Democratic presidential hopeful, has also said that globalisation has left far too many people behind, were his exact words. So there's not exactly a big vote of confidence of globalisation, is there?
And I think it's right to see that globalization has been not only a major source of progress, which undoubtedly it has, but also it's brought rising inequality and new risks. Pandemic spreading is one, but clearly climate change has accelerated because of it, and there are many other risks. The financial crisis was an underbelly of globalization. The answer, though, isn't to build higher walls. There's no wall high enough that's going to keep out climate change, a pandemic, or a financial crisis. The answer is that we need to manage this system that we've built. We need to ensure that we coordinate actions. We need to ensure that we understand the bads and that we build the institutions and the capabilities to manage them, whether it's climate change, whether it's finance, whether it's cyber, or whether it's pandemics. We can do it, but we have to have the will to do it, and we have to understand it.
So the origins of the problem become also part of the solution, are the vehicle through which you have to fix it, despite scepticism that you see.
That's right, and part of the reason there's the scepticism is because the experts and authorities got it dramatically wrong. They led a liberalization, a deregulation that resulted in the financial crisis. So when people say we don't trust the experts, we don't trust the authorities after the financial crisis, they become populist and nationalist. We have to say to them, you were right not to trust them, because they didn't manage the system.
Well, I mean, Bernie Sanders in the United States has said unfettered free trade has allowed multinational corporations to enjoy huge profits and make the rich even richer, while workers are sucked into a race for the bottom. Could what we're seeing now have an impact on trade? Because you have said that the epidemic will also prompt a re-examination of the world's central reliance on China as ground zero for manufacturing. So could China cease to be
I think we'll continue to see incredible growth of global economic activity and trade. Remember that increasingly the center of gravity is moving to Asia, and Asia is very enthusiastic in general about this integration. So we are in the US and North America and Europe increasingly marginal to this whole globalization trend. It will continue, it'll be increasingly Asia-centric, but I think we have reached peak supply chain fragmentation. And that's not only because of this coronavirus, I think that will accelerate it, but other things are happening. There's increasing automation and robotics, which is bringing systems back home. It won't be workers that are building our things at home, but it'll be machines increasingly, whether it's call centers or whether it's auto manufacturing. And then we have increasing customization. We want things modeled to our bodies, and we want instant delivery. Now, you can't do that from the other side of the world. So all these things are coming together.
So, and coronavirus will be an accelerator.
That's right. I think coronavirus will accelerate it, but it's a trend that was underlying already.
All right. And does that also apply to other ways of living? For example, people have really rolled back on their travel. The businesses are holding video conferences. People are saying they're going to holiday at home and, you know, not go abroad and so on. So do you think that this could have long-term consequences?
I think it will have some long-term consequences, but on an upward trend. You see the growth in tourism and travel globally has been almost 10% a year for the last 10 years. So let's say it comes down a couple of percent. It doesn't mean it stops growing. It means it doesn't grow as rapidly. And increasingly, that's been driven by travel and tourism out of Asia. That won't stop growing as people get wealthier, and wealth will increase. Incomes will increase as Asia grows, on average by over 4% a year. People will travel.
People have seen in China, for instance, with fewer people travelling now because of the coronavirus, that, you know, carbon dioxide emissions have gone down very substantially by about 5%.
There are some silver linings of this.
So could that really be, you know, a wake-up call for people that actually they will that the coronavirus will transform people's habits?
I don't think it's going to transform it in that dramatic way. I think we will see some easing off, but when we look back and we see how quickly people have rebounded to old habits, what we need to instill in societies is that we need to manage these risks nationally and internationally. The other thing that's happened, of course, is that oil prices have collapsed. So transport is going to become much cheaper. Now, I worry about that in the context of climate change. Our push to get off fossil fuels, which is absolutely essential, is going to be reduced by the fact that oil is now so cheap and competitive.
And just one idea as well that has been discussed is, could it encourage the free flow of information in countries which are a bit authoritarian? Because we saw the tragic death of the doctor Li Wenliang in China, who raised the alarm online, earning him a visit from the police who told him to stop spreading rumours. He died of the disease, of course, and he said on his deathbed, I think a healthy society should not only have one kind of voice, and that went viral. Could it have that kind of impact?
I hope so, but I think what the Chinese might also be saying is our way of managing this has been extremely effective, and I don't think they're going to be taking away from this that they weren't doing the right thing. Of course, it was picked up too late. There wasn't the communication around it, but their actions afterwards, which have been draconian, have dramatically helped the slowing of the spread. And, of course, what they've done is they've had a big hit on their economy. So China's taken a big hit as a result of trying to protect itself and the world.
So we've already seen the financial impact of coronavirus. So, Professor Ian Goldin, I ask you finally, you foretold that there would be a global economic crisis as a result of some pandemic. We're now looking at coronavirus. You must hope that you are wrong.
I absolutely do, but I hope also that we learn the lesson from this, that we don't become complacent, as happened in the run-up to the financial crisis, that we thought we knew what we were doing, and so we failed to manage the system. I hope this is I'm wrong, and that this is a massive wake-up call to stop the next pandemic, which is inevitable and could be more severe, to stop financial crises, to stop climate change, to stop other cascading risks. If we can learn from this that we are interdependent, that we all depend on people around the world to be doing the right thing, to be taking precautions in the right way, to be stopping risk. If we can do that internationally and nationally, it will have been worthwhile.
Thank you very much for coming on Hard Talk.
Thank you.
This is the BBC World Service, where in World Wise Web, teenagers talk to the technology pioneers who have shaped their lives.
We believed someday everybody would have a cell phone.
It's hard to imagine a world where the tech we take for granted didn't exist.
We didn't have email back then. You know, everything was mail, or we didn't have internet.
In each episode, you'll hear from a teenager, like me, talking to technological innovators who have already changed the world.
You're often called the mother of the internet. How do you feel about this title?
Finding out how they came up with their ideas.
I was starting to become a DJ. I had to carry 100 or 1,000 CDs, and they were very heavy.
Necessity is the mother of invention.
There's an MP3 player that can store 1,000 songs.
Yeah. 100 hours of music.
And asking for advice.
You gotta figure out what drives you. What makes you really happy?
You gotta make it happen for yourself. You can't just wait for it to happen to you. Grab it. Go for it.
World Wise Web, Saturday at 18:50 GMT.
Hello, I'm Manny Jasmy, and on this week's World Football we speak to the hero of Saarbrücken, goalkeeper Daniel Batz, who saved 5 penalties in one match as the team from the 4th tier reached the semi-finals of the German Cup. As games and entire leagues are postponed, we'll discuss the impact of the coronavirus on football and hear the unadulterated joy about playing for Manchester United for Odion Ogalo. Join Pat Nevin, Heather O'Reilly and me after the BBC News.
BBC News with Fiona MacDonald. Stock markets are again recording huge losses in response to the coronavirus pandemic. At one point, the Nikkei index in Japan was down by 10%. There have also been sharp falls in Hong Kong, South Korea, Australia and New Zealand. Portugal and Belgium have become the latest European countries to close schools to counter the spread of Covid-19. Earlier, France announced similar measures. The Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro says he's been tested for the coronavirus and is waiting for the results. In Canada, it's been confirmed that the wife of the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has tested positive. The United Nations Special Envoy for Yemen has warned that the country is at risk of a new cycle of violence and suffering. Martin Griffiths told the Security Council that all parties to the conflict must steer Yemen away from a precarious path. The US says it has carried out airstrikes in Iraq against a pro-Iranian militia. The Pentagon said the strikes were in retaliation for a rocket attack near Baghdad that killed 2 Americans and a British soldier. The Ivorian President Alassane Ouattara has named a close ally as the ruling party's candidate to succeed him. Mr Ouattara, who's not seeking re-election, said Amadou Gon-Coulibaly, the current Prime Minister, had the support of the vast majority of party members. A prayer meeting has been held in the New Zealand city of Christchurch ahead of the first anniversary of mass shootings which killed more than 50 people at 2 mosques. Hundreds of worshippers targeted by the gunmen are attending. And the head of football's governing body in the US, Carlos Cordeiro, has resigned and apologised for offending the national women's team. He said he took responsibility for legal papers that said the players had less skill and fewer responsibilities than their male counterparts. BBC News.
Yeah, good luck to whoever's going to drive that bus. Heather is here.